let's then get into the story of 1992's Aladdin, a film that had an infamous, inverted commas, Black Friday where it looked like the whole thing was in deep trouble. And then a weird moment where it looked like Tom Cruise was basically going to pull this one out of a hole.
We would be honoured if you would join us.
So, Aladdin goes back to 92. Credited directors, mainly because they directed it, John Musker and Ron Clements. The screenplay credited to, you ready for this? Ron Clements, John Musker, Ted Elliott, Terry Rossio. The story credits, I mean, so many writers contributed. There's one even not credited who we're going to talk to here. Bunny Matheson, Roger Allers, Dane Ships, Kevin Harkes, Sue Nichols, Francis Giebers, Daryl Rooney, Larry Leaker, James Fuigi, Kirk Hansen, Kevin Lima, Rebecca Reese, David S. Smith, Chris Sanders, Brian Pimentel, Patrick A. Ventura. The source is the classic story of Aladdin. And our story, though, starts in earnest in 1988. And a man called Howard Ashman, let's start with him. Now, Howard Ashman is a Disney legend and the subject of a brilliant documentary film from producer and director Don Hahn called Howard, which that film just about lives on Disney Plus around the edges of it. It's really worth digging out. Now, Howard Ashman, a lyricist and producer, his musical partner, so is Alan Menken. They've done things like Little Shop of Horrors together and The Little Mermaid. For the point of this story, Howard Ashman was and is credited with being such a crucial part of Disney Animation's revival of the late 1980s and the early 1990s. And at this stage, I mean, Disney was in the midst of The Little Mermaid. Beauty and the Beast was gradually building up. And there's two different versions of the story of how Aladdin came about. One was that Howard Ashman approached Peter Schneider, who was then overseeing Disney Animation, and said that Aladdin was sort of the missing movie, that Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin just seemed like a natural progression. Jeffrey Katzenberg, then chairman of Walt Disney Studios, who was overseeing all of Disney Animation, argued that he took the idea of Aladdin to him, but I don't think he was really that bothered who came up with the idea in the end. Basically, what happened was in 1988, Alan Menken and Howard Ashman got together and they presented early on in that year a 50-page outline for the film. And it was drawing from cliched takes a little bit on Arab culture. It was set in the Middle East. Disney was a little bit uneasy about elements of this. The inspiration for the Genie character at that point was singer Fats Waller. And, you know, even in the 1980s, it was, should we really be doing this? Is this problematic? Were there issues there? Now, Ashman and Menken had put together 6 songs already. I mean, they were racing on the film, but it was, I don't know, it just took a little while, as we're about to discover, to really take hold. Not least because they had to crack the script for Aladdin, the story. What was the approach going to be? But still, The Little Mermaid hit really big. I mean, it's hard to underestimate what a seismic turn The Little Mermaid was in the fortunes of Walt Disney Animation Studios. I mean, at the point I'm sat here, I mean, the studio is just crewing up is shortly to release Zootropolis, Zootopia 2, wherever you are in the world. Stuff like that. Would it be happening had this revival not happened in the 80s? No, I don't think it would, personally. By 1990, Aladdin was being crewed up. That it had gone through this early concept and now it was like, yeah, we should do this. Confidence was up. Beauty and the Beast wasn't having the easiest of production. The directors were replaced on Beauty and the Beast fairly early on in that film. But Aladdin was happening. However, there were problems that needed to be sorted out on Beauty and the Beast. So Howard Ashman and Alan Menken's time went over to that, just to get that over the line, to be part of the team that did so. So writers were now being hired, new writers being brought in to have a look at Aladdin, one of whom, not credited in that list that I read out, is Linda Wolverton, who'd written Beauty and the Beast. And she came up with a bunch of stuff in there. There were still kind of struggles cracking exactly what an Aladdin film would be. How would it be relevant in the early 1990s? One huge problem they had, just to give a flavour of this, was the character of the carpet, just the flying carpet, who is a character in the film but doesn't talk. And so on the one hand, you've got this character of Aladdin who's accompanied by a carpet, and they can't talk to each other. But then Aladdin's also accompanied by a monkey by the name of Apu. They don't talk to each other either. So Aladdin's mother is built into drafts at this stage, but there's still this concern. Who does Aladdin talk to? How do we kind of break this? How do we make it work? And then there was also the look of the film that they were really, really struggling to get. And the genie as well. How do you realise this character? Where do you put the genie in the midst of the story? Side character, central character, don't know. Various animators were trying different things, various designers trying different things. Without a script, they were coming up with concepts and ideas and thoughts. But it was a man called Eric Goldberg who cracked it. Now, Eric Goldberg would go on to direct Pocahontas for Disney, and an animation veteran, does loads of the 2D stuff still. I think to this day he's still doing 2D stuff. And if you go to the 2D animation in Moana, for instance, that's Eric Goldberg's work. I think if you go back to Enchanted, I think he's in there somewhere as well. But his idea, correct me if I'm wrong on all of that, but his idea for the look of the genie was inspired by a caricaturist by the name of Al Hirschfeld. And what Goldberg pitched to the Disney team was a genie who was not a conventional character. He was more inverted commas, puff of smoke. Now, there is an outstanding article in Premiere magazine from back in 1992 that went through an awful lot of this. And as Goldberg told Premiere at that point, it was just a major leap of imagination for everyone to make, for the character to be like that, this kind of puff of smoke idea. A Disney animation legend is Glen Keane. Glen Keane designed The Beast in Beauty and the Beast. He was the director of Tangled until he had heart problems, had to step away from that. But there's so much of Glen Keane's work throughout Disney in the 80s and 90s and royalty in animation. He urged Eric Goldberg to pursue this approach, the Al Hirschfeld approach. And also they weaved in S-curves, the letter S, into the design of the film as well. So the look of the character of the genie, there's a letter S generally at the heart of it. Even the carpet, the letter S was part and parcel of that. And it was just starting to come to life. What they still had a problem with, a mountain of problems with this film, but what they still had a problem with was the character of Aladdin himself. And Jeffrey Katzenberg was one of those who put his finger on it, which was they got these two central characters at the heart of the film. They got Aladdin and Jasmine, a fairly traditional Disney love story in theory. But as Katzenberg put it, I can see what he sees in her. What I don't see is what she sees in him. And this character of Aladdin, just who was he? Why was it working? Was it working? Why would you sit and watch a film about Aladdin? Why would you root for him? And they needed to make a change. This just wasn't working. But Katzenberg had a background with Paramount Pictures as well. That's where he came across from Disney, from Paramount to Disney. He would go on to co-form DreamWorks Animation, DreamWorks SKG, and head up DreamWorks Animation for many, many years. Katzenberg said, "Go and watch Top Gun." And so he argued that Aladdin had to have a flavour of Tom Cruise in Top Gun, something a bit more movie starry, something a little bit of undercurrent of attitude to him. And so Glen Keane and the team, they watched Top Gun and they saw it. They saw that little frisson of attitude coming through and they're just like, oh, okay, we can work with that. And so Keane, as he continued to evolve the look, the design of the character, the animation of the character, would keep a picture of Tom Cruise at his workstation right throughout. They had a movie star pretty much now at the heart of their film. They were going to get another one, but I'm leaving him towards the end. There was tragedy in the background, going back to Howard Ashman, because Howard Ashman had been diagnosed HIV positive and was gravely ill with AIDS and AIDS-related illnesses. And this at a point where treatment for AIDS was ineffective. And you don't need me to tell you just how many people were lost during that era of the 80s and 90s. So many brilliant people. Howard Ashman was one of them. And when The Little Mermaid won Oscars, Ashman wasn't there to pick them up. When Beauty and the Beast was going through production, well, he got to see a version of that film, never got to see its release, never got to see its impact. He was ill and he was dying. And so it was clear he couldn't complete his work on Aladdin. So Tim Rice, frequent collaborator with Andrew Lloyd Webber, was brought in to work with Alan Menken on the music instead. And Tim Rice will continue a relationship with Disney after this, but he was brought in to pick up some of the work that Howard Ashman had been doing and to put his own imprint on them. Also, off the success of The Little Mermaid, there was Ron Clements and John Musker, the two directors of that film. They also did The Great Mouse Detective, Basil the Great Mouse Detective, to us here in the UK, which I love that film, really love that film. The score to it by Henry Mancini as well is terrific, but never ended up on any of the old Disney albums or anything like that. But Musker and Clements had been given the option of 3 films to do next. I mean, they just steered The Little Mermaid to the stage of the Oscars. They were at the fulcrum of that. And so they were offered an adaptation of Swan Lake, an animated version of that, something loosely inspired by it. A film called King of the Jungle. King of the Jungle would make it to cinemas under a different name. That name would be The Lion King. But they decided to give Aladdin a go. And when they jumped aboard, lots of scripts and lots of writing had been done. So they went all the way through that. And they were looking really for what their version of this was, because they're writers as well. They were going to put their own imprint on it. In fact, one of the rules of John Musker was, taught to him by his children, was you've got a winner if you can get in an underwear joke. And so he wanted to bring in more comedy. They both wanted to bring that forward. They also wanted to move the character of the genie towards the centre of the film, to not be a support character, to be one of the key characters in the movie. By this stage, big action sequences had been identified, big blockbustery sequences, and lots of those actually remain pretty much intact from the previous drafts of the film. Some of the songs as well were there pretty much from the start, were hammered in fairly quickly as well. And the script was, with Clements and Musker, was soon locked, that they had a version of this that they could build in a very rough outline form. And they could put that on the wall in front of Disney executives, in front of the animators, and to see what they've got. The day they did that was Black Friday, and not in the shopping sense. It was on the Aladdin production schedule. It was known as Black Friday. It was April the 19th, 1991. Things went very, very wrong. And an 80-minute version of the film, very, very rough, lots of drawings, black and white as well, was put on the screen. And it's not uncommon in animation that early versions of films don't go down very well. I mean, the process is an awful lot of refinement. It was Mimi Evans who wrote the superb piece of Premiere magazine, and it was in its December 1992 issue. She detailed how the audience for that screening was Roy E. Disney, Jeffrey Katzenberg, there was Peter Schneider, who was chief of another of the chiefs of animation as well. And it was Katzenberg as chairman of the studio who tried to rally the troops afterwards, but inside, I think he was having some kind of struggle with it. It was left to Peter Schneider to say, we hated it. God, he said to Premiere, there was nothing about it that worked. April the 19th, 1991, creatively was the low point of Aladdin, and also the film would be on screens 18 months down the line. However, they needed to go right the way back to sort this out. Now, again, it's not unusual, not Tom Jones, it's not unusual for an animated film's early version to go down badly. The Lion King story, the animated version, was a year ahead of the release of it. The Lion King was said to be in one hell of a state, but still, no one was kidding themselves that Aladdin was in some degree of trouble here. And the first plan, get in some new writers. So, this is where Terry Rossio and Ted Elliott come into the story. Now, these two would go on to write the Pirates of the Caribbean films. At this stage, they were less experienced, they were less high profile. But along with Musker and Clements, they were re-outlining the story. And then Rossio and Elliott would go and work on it and submit submit some more script. Musker and Clements would critique that script, send it back to Rossio and Elliott. They would write it again, critique, write again, etc., until the modular bits of the script came together. And the eventual screenplay for Aladdin had elements that were going right the way back to, this had been going since like the late 80s. So some of the early stuff was still in there, lots of new stuff as well. There was still an ongoing argument, actually, about one of the rules that Linda Wolverton had put into one of the original screenplays, that the genie could only allow 3 wishes. Well, Musker and Clements for a while looked at changing that, and the idea was that the genie could do infinite wishes. However, they stepped back away from that idea. It was during Rossio and Elliott's retooling. First of all, the 3 wishes were then just set in stone. The character of Aladdin's mother came out as well, but this also turned the character of Aladdin again, because now all of a sudden, without a mother, he's more of a street kid, and a little bit more of that attitude came out. I don't think we're talking Tom Cruise in Magnolia, but Tom Cruise was still like a kind of vague template for Harrison Ford was cited as another one as well, that kind of like almost matinee movie starish kind of thing. The removal of Aladdin's mother from the story took out one of what was regarded as one of the best songs, one of Howard Ashman's, As It Happened, Proud of Your Boy. And in fact, there is a collection, a music collection put out, I think a 4-disc collection, which has some of the songs that never made it into things like Beauty and the Beast, and Aladdin in particular. There was quite a lot of work done that you didn't hear in the final version. Ashman passed in 1991, didn't get those Oscars for the last 6 months of his life. He was also very ill, that he was barely able to speak, and so he still contributed work. He worked with Alan Menken on the song Prince Ali, for instance, but he was too ill to record the demo for it. Even when they showed him sequences, they showed him You Never Had a Friend Like Me, that song and dance sequence from Aladdin, but his eyesight was fading and he would struggle, and he passed in the end in March of 1991, having contributed the songs Arabian Nights, Friend Like Me, Prince Ali. The last song that he wrote was one called Humiliate the Boy, which didn't make it into the final cut of it. And it just cast a shadow over not just Aladdin, but also Walt Disney Animation Studios at that point. The film was improving, though, and by October 1991, Jeffrey Katzenberg was happier, much happier. And the previews kept coming, and the film kept building. They kept throwing up new versions of it, critiquing it. And this was going on till very, very late. That there were still changes in that last year. 4 scenes were reanimated quite late on. A couple of scenes revoiced as well. The final cast was coming together. I mean, Gilbert Gottfried was an unusual choice. For instance, the late Gilbert Gottfried talked about it an awful lot on his podcast before he passed as well. And then there was another piece of casting, which I'll come to shortly. But while all this was going on, don't forget, in the background, Disney scored a monster hit with Beauty and the Beast, the first animated film to get a Best Picture Oscar nomination. A huge box office success. It sold a metric ton of videotapes as well. And to this day is regarded as one of the best animated films that Walt Disney Animation Studios has ever done. But because Aladdin was so far down the line, they didn't really feel the pressure in the same way of that success as the teams on the films that followed, The Lion King and Pocahontas in particular, would be feeling. The other then ingredient in Aladdin, and I've saved it, I've knocked it completely out of chronological order to do this, was Robin Williams. The late Robin Williams as the voice of the genie. And he was chosen from a list, and they knew they wanted to go movie starry, and so Steve Martin was on the list. Eddie Murphy was on the list as well. But it was Robin Williams, I think Musker and Clements were really pushing for. They sort of had in mind as well when they were rewriting the genie too. Williams was busy. He was very in demand. At the point he started his recording work on Aladdin, he was shooting Hook for Steven Spielberg. Then he would move on to Toys for Barry Levinson, a long-time passion project for Barry Levinson, that director of Rayman, of course, Oscar-winning director. And so he had pretty much back-to-back projects. I think Being Human for Bill Forsyth was around that point as well. But he was doing his Aladdin work while he was also doing those films. Now, unusually for a Disney animation, Robin Williams, was allowed to ad-lib. Usually it's quite heavily scripted. The animators needed specific things to animate to. But in the case of Robin Williams, they just let him go. They put him in the recording booth, and then it was the job of Eric Goldberg, the supervising animator of the Genie, to take Robin Williams' recordings away, find the best gags, find the funniest stuff, and then animate around that. I mean, it was said that Williams did like 40, 50 different characters effectively in his interpretation of the Genie. And I think it's pretty well known that there is hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of footage that we on our side of the fence have not heard that he recorded for the Genie in Aladdin as well. It also encouraged some rule breaking as well. I mean, we're used to cross-referencing and inverted commas, things go meta and stuff like that now. But the idea of a Disney film referencing other Disney stuff so overtly, to have pop culture references and little nods here and there, that was new. That came out of a lot of the improvisation as well. All these hat tips to other films too. And the thing is, Disney had got a bargain that they had hired Robin Williams for a scale rate. They weren't paying his fee, which at that point was around $8 million a movie. They paid him $75,000. Now, Disney was notoriously a lowballer on salaries in the early 1990s. Jack Nicholson got really close to taking on the role of Hades in Hercules, for instance. Musker and Clements did a whole bunch of interviews, and they talked about that, but it was the sticking point was the salary, that Disney just wouldn't pay Nicholson's price. Williams agreed, though, because I mean, he wanted to do it, but also he agreed on the basis that he wouldn't be used in publicity. That I was really conscious that he had another film coming as well. He had Toys that was going to be out around the same time. What he didn't really want was two competing Robin Williams projects going out at the same time, and as such, he wanted to be sure that there was no clash. Disney was, his confidence was certainly up. The film was really, really coming together as well. And you go right the way through where we were in the 1990s. And Disney videos were selling by the ton. And so Disney was in that period where it would release a film, then put it on, inverted commas, moratorium for, 7 years. So memorably, if you tried to buy the Little Mermaid video after it had gone off sale, you were waiting 7-8 years for it to come round again. And it would cycle things like Snow White and the Jungle. And it was just getting into its groove there, knowing that these videos would be sold en masse. And also there was a trailer for Aladdin at the front of loads and loads and loads of them. The film was ready for release November the 11th, 1992. It had cost around $25-30 million to make, and it was, modest really, but that's around the cost of the same Toy Story as well. It was kind of a little bit the going rate for animation at this point. The critical reviews for it were, I don't think they were quite at the level of Beauty and the Beast. I think it's worth noting that. However, the critical response was trained very, very, very heavily on Robin Williams as the Genie. That as much as the film was enjoyed, there was some pushback on some of its representation. On the whole, the story, I think there's some pushback on the story as well. But even those who weren't warming to it particularly were warming to Robin Williams. It got to the point where Disney considered an Oscar campaign for Best Actor for Robin Williams. I think in fact it pushed the campaign but just didn't get the nomination. Audiences went mad for it. I mean, they were rating it really, really highly, and Disney knew it had something. I mean, it just had the confidence in this. It did a very slow rollout release. It actually came out the weekend of November the 13th to the 15th, 1992 in the US, and they played it on, let me just double, I think it's on 2 screens. And it opened with a screen average per screen of just shy of $100,000. So even though it was only playing on 2 screens for one weekend, it had nearly $200,000 in the bank on the first weekend where it debuted. That was the weekend that Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula topped the charts with $30.5 million. Wesley Snipes in Passenger 57. A little bit of trivia there. If you look at Passenger 57, the same extra dies 3 times in that film. Other films that were were around on wide release were A River Runs Through It from Robert Redford, Under Siege, The Mighty Ducks, known as Champions here in the UK, the brilliant The Last of the Mohicans, the very, very troubled Jennifer 8, the first Candyman movie, the erotic thriller Consenting Adults, and Pure Country, which is a film I've never watched in my entire life. The following week, well, Disney kept up its two-screen strategy for Aladdin, the word of mouth coming. It also didn't want to go directly against Home Alone 2, which opened that weekend with 31 million, but still Aladdin was bringing in, nearly $90,000 a screen. Playing on just 2 cinemas, it brought in nearly $750,000 over the course of its first 2 weeks. Eventually, Disney went wide. The screen count went over 1,000 on its third weekend out there, and the film was up to second place, 19 million. Home Alone 2 still at the top with 28. Also launching that week was The Bodyguard with Kevin Costner and Whitney Houston. But other than that, it was films like Dracula, Malcolm X was about, still River Runs Through It, Passenger 57, the extra dying 3 times. Aladdin actually was, it endured more than soared at the top of the chart. Eddie Murphy and The Distinguished Gentleman came along the week after. Directed by Jonathan Lynn. Quite a good little movie that is as well. Home Alone 2, though, was bringing the money. The Bodyguard was bringing the money. Then by mid-December, out comes A Few Good Men. That tops the chart. But Aladdin just continues to hold its place. Held off a challenge from The Muppet Christmas Carol, which arrived in mid-December. Aladdin, over Christmas, though, was going back up. Went up to number 2 in the charts over the Christmas period. Finally topped the chart in the US for the first time 8 weeks into its release. 8 weeks, January the 1st to the 3rd, 1993, Aladdin had its time at the top of the US box office chart. It would be back up again by the end of January. And, its time at the top of the chart was about 3-4 weeks, but all of them, like 2-3 months after it had been released. $217.3 million at the US box office, the biggest single animated film at the US box office in Disney's history at that point. Another $129 million outside of the US, total worldwide gross $346 million. And then, the Oscars didn't come this time for Best Picture. There wasn't that nomination, but Best Original Score went to Alan Menken. The song A Whole New World won for Best Original Song, Menken and Tim Rice. Howard Ashman's Friend Like Me was nominated. And it came away with 2 Oscars, and Disney came away with a really huge hit. And this was at the era where it was just starting to explore, I say it with some degree of shudder, those almost dreaded straight-to-video sequels. And so it had this idea of doing another Aladdin film that would become The Return of Jafar. However, about a year after the release of Aladdin, the unhappiness of Robin Williams with Disney kind of spilled out. Now, Williams and Disney had had a very successful run. Good Morning Vietnam, Dead Poets Society, now Aladdin. 3 huge hits, and they'd sort of helped each other there. But Williams went on American television on the Today Show, as reported by the Los Angeles Times in November 1993, and, quote, accused the Walt Disney Company of, inverted commas, lying to him, an allegation. Disney lawyers, you can back off. Breaching an agreement not to use his voice to merchandise products inspired by the hit animated film Aladdin, wrote the Los Angeles Times. He just suggested that his bridges with Disney were burned. He wasn't going to go back to the studio. Now, Disney executives didn't comment on the record on his remarks, but it's interesting in the Los Angeles Times piece that there's a source familiar with the dispute, they wrote, characterised Williams' comments as sour grapes because he was paid scale of $75,000 for his work on an animated film that went on to gross more than $200 million domestically. Yeah, I'd have some degree of sour grapes, I think. But as Williams told the Today Show, you realise now when you work for Disney why the mouse only has 4 fingers, because he can't pick up a cheque. And so he also gave that interview to 1 or 2 other places. I think he did it to New York Magazine as well. And what he argued to the Today Show was, we had a deal. The one thing I said was, I'll do the voice. I'm doing it basically because I want to be part of this animation tradition. I want something for my children. And one deal is, I just don't want to sell anything. I don't want to be a Burger King thing or toys stuff. He just didn't want it. Now, Disney countered all of this and argued that it had run all its marketing and promotion, of which the Genie from Aladdin was front and centre, past Robin Williams and his wife at the time as well. And then it tried to build bridges by sending him a Picasso painting for his home. But I think it was Business Insider ran an article that suggested that that didn't go down well because it just didn't fit the decor of his home either. The painting was said to be around $1 million. Williams not particularly happy. Also happening around this time was the release of Toys had happened, and Toys had not done well at all. And one of the reasons for that, as much as there are problems with Toys, it's worth noting, was the clash with Aladdin as well. Disney then wanted Williams back to voice the Genie for the straight-to-video experiment it was doing, The Return of Jafar. Williams was having no shift at all. It was Dan Castellaneta, who voices Homer Simpson, who was ultimately hired to voice the Genie there. And it was only in the end, this was only resolved a couple of years later, when Jeffrey Katzenberg left Disney to go and form DreamWorks, and Joe Roth came in as chairman of the studio, and Roth made a public apology, which meant Williams would return to voice the Genie for the third film. This was heavily promoted off the back of Robin Williams' back. He'd make a couple more films with Disney as well. He'd do Jack with Francis Ford Coppola, Bicentennial Man with Chris Columbus. He'd do those with the studios as well. In terms of what Disney did with Aladdin afterwards, I mean, we're in the era where you can't have a hit animated movie if you don't try and make a live action version of it. That's exactly what happened here as well. Not content with the straight to DVD sequels that we got, Aladdin and the King of Thieves was the second one. Not content with the really good Sega Mega Drive game. It's a really, really, really good game, that as well. In 2019, we got a live action version of it as well. We've also had a Broadway show. And what I find interesting about this story, you go back to that day, that Black Friday, where the whole thing just was in an absolute state. I do wonder if you could have gone into that room and told any of the people there, do you know what? In 35 years' time, this will be a hit Broadway musical. There'll be another movie. There'll be sequels. It will have made Disney billions. Would they have believed you? I'm really not sure they would.